Hello and welcome to Unstress, exploring stress and health from a holistic perspective. I'm Dr Ron Ehrlich. Now, when it comes to what we should eat as individuals, the idea of what is appropriate for our individual needs, sensitivities and reactions would seem like a great concept. We've been exploring the theme of cancer as a metabolic disease, the importance of minimizing insulin levels, and the power of ketogenic diets and fasting. Now, my guest today is nutritionist, naturopath, educator, author, and PhD candidate Cliff Harvey. Cliff has been working on these very subjects for over 20 years. He's written 6 books, the titles of which tell you a lot about this guy. The carbohydrate appropriate diet, the ketogenic appropriate diet, 99 things you need to know to lose weight. We'll cover some of those issues today. He's also written a book called Time Rich, Cash Optional, an unconventional guide to happiness, and another one called Time Rich Practice. Cliff is passionate. This is a quote from one of his books. As practitioners, that's as health practitioners, we are in the enviable position of doing something we love. We have the opportunity to help people become healthier, happier, fitter, and stronger. Boy, I love that. And then he wrote a book called Choosing You, a thoughtful, inspiring book which takes you on a journey of empowerment, self-belief, and personal responsibility. Well, today we chose him. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Cliff Harvey. Welcome to the show, Cliff.
Hey, Ron, how you doing?
I'm doing really well. Cliff, I've been so looking forward to talking to you. We've been following through a theme about cancer as a metabolic disease. We've been exploring ketogenic diets and all that. And I know you've got a lot of research background in this, but you've got a story, your own story, which I thought I'd love to hear how you got into this position that you find yourself in now.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's probably quite convoluted, to be honest. I mean, I started out, really got into the nutrition field because of footy. You know, I was a pretty skinny kid as a teenager, and I wanted to make the top line footy team, and the coaches came to me and said, well, you're too small, but if you put on X amount of weight, not only will you play in the top team, you'll captain it. If you don't put on the weight, you won't play at all. So that sort of sent me down this track of looking into everything I could around strength training and nutrition. And so I really started with a performance bias. And that started to shift when I was first at university. And this is really where the low carb part started was, you know, we were told these very arbitrary things back in the day. We must prescribe 65% calories from carbohydrate as a minimum. You know, we had to basically have this primacy of carbohydrate, the old food pyramid style guidelines. And the interesting thing was we had learned quite different things in our basic sciences, you know, anatomy and physiology and basic nutrition. We had learned the physiology of nutrients, and that didn't mesh with what we were being told to prescribe. And so as I started to develop plans for myself and for the clients I was working with as a student practitioner, when I worked out their caloric requirements and then allotted their macronutrients within that, the arithmetic didn't work out. When we were optimizing protein and even just giving them the minimum levels of fat to preserve hormonal status and to, you know, prevent the incidence of overreaching and overtraining and things like that, there wasn't enough left to give them this very high carbohydrate amount that we were being told to. So that sent me off down the track of asking inconvenient questions. And I think, as you know, I was kicked out of nutrition class at university for asking those questions.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the best things that happened, to be honest, because I felt like I'd been set free. They gave me a pass, which was great. So at least I passed the course. But I sort of felt set free to look at this pragmatically and to really take what I considered to be a true evidence-based approach to it, because I was using evidence. And I was lucky enough in those first couple of years to work with, top-level athletes, from top-line rugby players through to members of the New Zealand Rugby League team, through to Olympians and Commonwealth Games athletes, but also people struggling with chronic disease and disorder, the morbidly obese, people in the 200 kilo plus club. and really got fantastic results from a variety of lower carb interventions, ranging from keto through to, moderated carb for the athletes. And so I guess in that respect, I was one of the first practitioners to really start to apply ketogenic diets in Australasia. This is back in 1998, really started to do this. So 20 years down the track, it's quite interesting how things have shifted around and how my practice has shifted around as well through all the various things that I have sort of traversed in that time.
Because this was, firstly, let me say that when we talk about performance and rugby, people, I think listening to this in Australia would know anybody from New Zealand would consider that the ultimate to be playing. But anyway, this was in an environment, though, of not just the food pyramid, but a low-fat dogma, which almost makes a 65% carbohydrate essential to, if you're going to go low-fat, where are you going to get your energy from?
Oh, exactly. And that was the thing, really, was that with the very low fat guideline, because of fear, really. I mean, people were scared of fat. But we've got to remember as well that a lot of people at the time, the orthodox practitioners, were also very scared of protein. And a lot of what I was doing originally was based off of the reevaluation of fat, but it wasn't necessarily always high fat at that time. It was really also the reevaluation of the role of protein and how important it was to optimize our protein intake. And at the time, there was probably more research coming out, I guess, around optimizing protein intake and how that was the first cusp of changing people away from this primacy of carbohydrate. So really, I think a lot of it was driven by protein. And interestingly now, I think a lot of LCHF people...
Hang on, for our listener.
Low carb, high fat.
Yep, okay.
A lot of people in that field are starting to also come back to protein and realize that perhaps, those of us, or not me necessarily, but a lot of people in the low carb field have also become scared of protein. And so that's shifting as well now.
Okay, well, look, I do want to go down, and I know I love the fact that you talk about appropriate. The word appropriate is something that figures very strongly in your whole approach. But I wondered whether we might just take a step back and do a couple of definitions for our listeners so we can kind of put this into an overall perspective. Like people hear the word ketogenic and ketosis. Can you give an idea of, you just define that for our listener and, a couple of, not too complex, but.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think what I teach my students is it's a really good idea to, when you come across words that you don't understand or you're not sure of, break them down. And I think most people know, for example, what Genesis means. Those of us who went to maybe Bible school or something when we were younger, or at least we were familiar with it. We know that Genesis means the beginning, the start. And so when we break that down and we say ketogenesis, we're meaning that that's the creation or the start of that production of ketones in the body. So ketones are a fuel that can be created from fat in particular, but also some amino acids, which we derive from protein, that can be used by most tissue throughout the body. And interestingly, it can be used by the brain and central nervous system. And a lot of people think that the brain and central nervous system only uses glucose or sugar for fuel. But in fact, it can use a range of fuels, and ketones are one of those primary fuels it can use. So when we look at the term ketosis, osis is really a term for the state of being. So what's our state of being? And ketosis is that state of being or state of metabolism in which we have those ketones available to use as fuel.
Beautiful. Can you be on a ketogenic diet without being in ketosis?
Not really, because by definition, a ketogenic diet is one that encourages the creation of ketones consistent with being in nutritional ketosis. So really the two are dependent on one another. But what we can certainly have is, and what we do have all the time, in fact, is production of ketones. A lot of people don't realize that because they think that to be in ketosis, it's like an on-off switch. You're either in ketosis or you're out. But when we talk about ketosis, we're actually simplifying and saying we're in nutritional ketosis, which is a particular level of ketones in the blood. However, even if we're eating a non-ketogenic diet, a high-carb diet, a traditional standard diet, we still produce ketones all the time and we use ketones all the time. But it's at very, very minimal amounts that only just show a little sort of blip in the blood, really.
So when we are in ketosis, how do we define that in a measurable way?
It's a good question, because the simple answer is there is a sort of line in the sand which we've drawn as researchers and clinical nutritionists, which is a level of beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the main fuel ketone, a level of beta-hydroxybutyrate in the blood of greater than 0.5 millimoles per liter. I say it's sort of a convention that we've developed because it doesn't actually have a lot of strong evidence to show that that is the exact measure. And there probably isn't an exact measure, because some people thrive on a ketogenic diet even if they're only sort of at 0.3 or 0.4. Other people find they need a little bit more, and a lot of it's going to be dependent on the outcome that you require.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that there's, we have this on-off switch idea about a lot of things. Either you've got it or you haven't. Either you are or you're not. But of course, there's lots of shades in between. So I find that quite encouraging that we're still using our ketones. But let's go to another, before we get into this in a little more. The other term that we hear a lot about is low carb. How do we define low carb?
Great question. I've just had a few battles with peer reviewers for the scientific journals because the definition of low carb is, again, so broad. And in a nutshell, really, low carb is anything that is under the standard minimum guideline for carbohydrate. So in New Zealand and Australia, it's basically defined as anything under 45% calories from carbohydrate. Now, a lot of us would consider a diet that's around 40% calories from carbohydrate certainly not low carb, but it actually is when we look at those definitions like that. So really, it's a very broad category. There's not really a defined, state of low carb. But in general, it's basically when people start to be aware of the role of carbohydrate, reduce that carbohydrate, and then see where they fit in on that spectrum. And of course, that's why I call it the carb appropriate spectrum, because it's not about one type of diet being best. It's about finding out what's best for you.
Because, that this is an important point, because it becomes an exercise in semantics in a way, because when you look at the recommended daily intake of nutrients, I've seen figures of 300 grams of carbohydrate per day as being a recommended daily intake. And so when some nutritionists or dietitians talk about low carb, it could be 150 or 200 grams. And to other people like Atkins, when they start, it's around 20 grams, isn't it? So there's quite a range in what people are talking about when they're doing their research on low carb, isn't it?
Oh, exactly. And so that's an interesting point, because when you're reading through the scientific literature and you're sort of looking at headlines of, low carb diet causes this or this effect, this or the other effect, you need to be aware of what they're actually talking about. And so it does, require us to go into those methods and see what they're actually talking about. The other interesting thing there is no one really knows, no one knows what an optimal ketogenic diet is, probably because there is none. It's going to vary between individuals. And there's a lot of debates that are probably meaningless. You see people debating online, well, you should be under 20 grams of carbs per day, or you should be under 50 grams, or no, it should be 30 grams. I mean, those types of fine differences that people debate they're probably missing the forest for the trees. There's probably more important things to worry about than 5 grams of carbs here and there.
Yeah. Well, I think this is going to be part of our discussion about appropriate, but back to some other definitions, because another one that we're very familiar with, this concept that's been almost pushed down our throats, is calories in, calories out. You should be, or this other idea of caloric restriction. What do we mean by caloric restriction? Is it different from the calories in, calories out idea?
Not really. They're two parts of the same continuum, I guess. Calories in, calories out is going to be important. And I think something that people have missed in the whole debate around where those calories should come from is the reality that we can't get past the first law of thermodynamics. Even if there's other things that will temper that, the idea that the calories that we take in need to be expended or we're going to get bigger is true. The interesting thing within that, though, is how do we achieve the proper regulation of calories? And this is an area that myself and my colleagues are really hot on because it's almost been neglected. This is an area that is not paid a lot of attention to because people always talk about calories in versus calories out, or no, calories don't matter. It's all about the types of foods you're eating or the macros that you're eating. But what we typically see is when we change our macros, that actually changes our caloric intake if we're eating ad libitum, in other words, as much as we desire. So this is a really good example of that is when people eat more protein, typically they're more satiated and they end up auto-regulating their caloric intake better. In other words, they eat a more appropriate amount. So calories are important, but the key there is how do we achieve calorie balance? Because the old style Jenny Craig's Weight Watchers, where you had to actively portion control and starve yourself, they simply didn't work. A great example of the whole debate, which can be summarized, is in the early days of the low-carb research, they often compared calorie-restricted high-carb diets to ad libitum, in other words, eat as much as you desire, low-carb, high-fat diets. And guess what? The people ended up eating pretty much the same amount of calories. The difference is the people on the lower carb diets didn't realize they were restricting because in fact they were just auto-regulating their caloric intake. So yes, it comes down to calories, but how we achieve that is important because adherence and compliance to diet are the biggest factors.
Yeah. Now, this is probably a good point to say, we're talking about macronutrients being proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, and there are essential intakes for protein. Correct me if I'm wrong here. This is a question, are there minimal recommended daily intakes for fat and protein? And is carbohydrates an essential, macronutrient?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is one of the things that we really need to understand more about. And this is, a topic that I talk a lot about in my lectures. There absolutely are essential amino acids that we derive from protein, and there's essential fatty acids that we derive from lipids or fats. And so to get in enough of those essential amino acids and essential fatty acids, we do need to eat a certain amount of protein and fat each and every day. Of course, we can fast occasionally and things like that, but on balance over time, we need to make sure we're getting in enough of these things. The interesting thing with carbohydrate is that there is no essential minimum amount. Because essential in the nutrition sciences means you need to ingest it, not that it's really important or necessary within the body. There's no minimum requirement for carbohydrate because if we withdraw carbohydrate completely from the diet, we can make up for that. We can create glucose within the body through gluconeogenesis or that creation of new glucose. And we can also use other fuels. We can directly oxidize protein. We can create ketones, which the brain and central nervous system can run on. And so there's no minimum requirement for carbohydrate.
Yeah. And this word essential, just for our listener, there are, 22 amino acids and we can produce, we can produce some, we can't produce others, and that's what makes them essential. Is that an oversimplification or?
No, that's exactly right.
That's exactly. And the same is true of those fatty acids. We can produce some fats within our body, but there are some we can't produce, and that's what makes them essential.
Yeah, exactly. There's those two essential fatty acids, alpha-linolenic and linoleic acid, and we just can't create them within the body. So that's what makes them essential. I think the confusion comes in because people think, well, glucose is essential inside the body because there are certain tissue types that can't use fat for fuel, for example. And so they immediately jump to thinking, well, it's essential. But that's just a difference of definition because in the nutrition sciences, we consider essential to mean you must eat it. And we certainly don't need to eat carbohydrate. It doesn't mean that carbohydrate is bad or that we shouldn't eat it. It just means that we should eat it according to our requirement, not according to some arbitrary standard that people put in place back in the 1970s.
Yeah, well, this will lead us into that appropriate discussion. But just still on, I'm enjoying these definitions, Cliff. This is like doing a course in nutrition. Fasting, that's something, I think one of the most intriguing things is we reflect on our ancestral past, but scarcity was a very important part of that ancestral past. We didn't always have an abundance of food. So tell us, fasting is we're becoming more aware of how important that is. What is the difference between intermittent fasting and fasting?
Yeah, again, a good question. I first got into the topic of fasting back in, it must be around 2001, 2002, when I really started looking into it. I had some clients who were Islamic and they were bodybuilders, and they were going into Ramadan, and they were really worried that they would lose all their muscle and gain all this fat and suffer poor health because of fasting. Because, of course, as you know, at the time, we were pretty much told that if possible, you should eat more than 6 times per day. You should eat as frequently as possible to keep your blood glucose stable and to keep a constant influx of nutrients and all this kind of stuff. And there was actually some research around at the time, and I looked into that. And what I saw was that there was no detriment to performance or health. No appreciable detriment. In fact, most people ended up being probably a little bit better off because they got better at using fat for fuel. Their cardiometabolic indicators like their blood lipids, their cholesterol, their blood glucose all improved. And that really changed my way of looking at things because I was already interested in low carb and keto and had been applying that for several years. But we had still been eating pretty frequently. And the biggest thing that it did at that point was it really stopped us being married to the clock. If you're out and you're busy and you're active and you're doing things, there's no point eating on the run because that's not part of our natural state. It's not good to eat when we're in that fight or flight response. So basically it allowed us to eat when we're hungry until we're full and then eat again when we're hungry. Of course, things have shifted a lot now where people are actively fasting, and I think that's great as well. And really the definition, though, is again quite broad. A fast is any period of calorie restriction, quite extreme calorie restriction for any period of time. And that's why people might consider a fast to be eating, say, 200 calories a day or 500 calories a day. The old 5-2 protocol started that way, where you'd eat normal calories for 5 days and then low calories for 2 days. Other people consider it to mean just not eating at all. Mm-hmm. And intermittent fasting is when people are doing that frequently. And so typically that takes the form of, say, a 16-8 diet where people are fasting for 16 hours and they've got an 8-hour feeding window. Or it could be 24, which is a 20-hour fast and a 4-hour feeding window. One of the terms that's coming in a lot now is time-restricted feeding, which I actually really like because that, I think, sums it up a little bit more effectively. So you're basically restricting your feedings to various times, and you can do that based on what's going to work best for you because not every fasting strategy is going to work for every person.
No, I think this is really fascinating because this idea of 6 meals a day, really, this is kind of built literally on the food pyramid and the 65% carbohydrate intake and keep low fats. You just got to do that to stay.
Exactly.
And this fear of hunger.
Yeah.
Like hunger, look, a great economic model, not a great health model. But if you were doing 16-8 but if you had a coffee in the morning as part of your 16, that wouldn't be so good, would it? Does coffee push up insulin? How does coffee fit into a 16-8 diet? I'm being distracted here, but go on. I just couldn't help but ask you.
Well, I think there is a minor insulin response to caffeine, but it's pretty minimal. Okay. And on balance, I don't think it really has much functional effect. The interesting thing with caffeine, caffeine obviously encourages increased fatty acid oxidation, so you're going to burn a little bit more fat. And again, it's a pretty small effect size, but it can actually add up over time. And interestingly, caffeine is ketogenic. They saw I'll have to try and remember the figures here, but I think it was a 2 to 3-fold increase in ketone production when people were drinking coffee with their breakfast versus not. And you got to remember here, the breakfast was toast, jam, and tea. So it was a very traditional high carb breakfast. And people were still producing appreciably more ketones, which is why I talk about caffeine as being, an interesting ketogenic supplement, because it absolutely is.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear that. But listen, you've been doing research. You're currently doing your PhD as well. Tell us a little bit, and that you've written several books about appropriate nutrition, appropriate carbohydrate, appropriate ketogenic. Let's talk about this word appropriate and tell us a little bit about what that means. Sounds appealing.
Yeah, well, it really came from, initially the idea was, the idea came from those early days of practice when I was allocating protein and fat first, which was not done at the time. Typically, people would apply carbohydrate and then they'd sort of pay attention to protein maybe, but probably not in the right amounts. And then whatever was left, people would give to fat. And as we discussed, given that protein and fat are essential, surely you would allocate those first to try and optimize human potential. So that's where it came from, was that idea that you allocate protein and fat first, and then whatever's left in the calories you basically have as carbohydrate. What I realized over the years was that the protein intake didn't necessarily always shift as much as the other macros, because once you optimize protein, then it really comes down to what the person's carbohydrate tolerance is and how they burn fat, versus carbohydrate. And so there was quite a big shift there. And, there are some people that will thrive on a high carb diet. There's no doubt about that. There are obviously people as well who thrive on a very low carb diet. And so the idea of carb appropriate is just figuring out what type of diet works best for the individual. And what we also need to remember there is that's not always just physiological either. Sometimes people will respond much better to a particular diet in the long term because it's easier to adhere to. One thing that we've seen, and certainly seen in our research, is that people probably who are, a little bit more on that metabolic disorder syndrome, so maybe they've got a bit of insulin resistance, they do just tend to adhere to low carb better. And we think it's just because if your problem is that you're really compulsively driven to eat sugar and carbohydrate, telling you to moderate that is like telling an alcoholic to just have a quarter of a bottle of vodka. It's not going to work, right? You want to have more. And this is what we hear, and we wrote this in a qualitative paper actually. This is a really common thing. Whereas the people who were less insulin resistant, the people who were probably a little bit more active, maybe in better shape, they could typically say, you know what, I like low carb, but I do like to have some kumara, some yams, some good quality carbs here and there, and it doesn't really affect me negatively. And it's mainly because they're not then driven to overdo it.
So, Cliff, what are the parameters that makes a carbohydrate appropriate nutrition? What are some of the things we should be considering in that carbohydrate intake?
Yeah, it's pretty broad. And, one of the things that I first started looking at way back in the day was this idea that carbohydrates are activity dependent. And that was driven by, the role of carbohydrate, which is as fuel. It made sense that while we had structural aspects and functional aspects with respect to the creation of tissue and the creation of hormones and things like that from protein and fat, because carbohydrate is pretty much just fuel, it made sense that the more active you were, the more likely you could tolerate higher levels of carbohydrate and in fact benefit from higher levels of carbohydrate. Now that's true even if you're a low carb athlete or you're a person who's more predisposed to a low carb diet. It could still be that you're on a low carb or an even ketogenic diet that includes slightly more carbohydrate because you're more active, particularly if that activity is predominantly glycolytic, in other words, that sugar burning activity, which is high intensity activity. So activity is a big part of it. Underneath that, there's also, various factors that probably play a role, and the research isn't really there to support a lot of it very strongly, but we would certainly say that there's likely to be genes involved with whether you are more predisposed to a higher or low carb diet. Certainly, insulin resistance versus sensitivity probably has some role to play, but that still hasn't been shown strongly in the research either. And we think as well that your baseline metabolic state, basically just how you store fuel, and we can see that in the blood through your lipid panel, your cholesterol, HDL, LDL, triglycerides, and your HbA1c, we think that those baseline indicators of cardiometabolic health really tell us a lot about whether you should be on a low, very low, or moderate carb diet. And we've actually got a paper coming out soon that will hope to show that.
Now, back onto the metabolic rate, because I think, we talked about calories in, calories out, and that this was important, but isn't one of the problems with the traditional approach to that, the dieting part of that, is that, yes, for the first few weeks, calories in, calories out, you might lose weight, but part of the problem of dieting is that the metabolic rate then changes too with the calorie restriction.
Yeah, that's a problem in so much as if our metabolic rate goes down significantly, which it will do, that's metabolic adaptation to diet, so metabolic adaptation to calorie restriction, then that might make it harder to adhere. It's not necessarily a problem in and of itself, because if we have a slightly slower metabolic rate and we have less requirement for calories, that's actually quite a good survival position to be in. But it's a good survival position to be in if you're living 100,000 years ago in an environment of scarcity where you don't have a lot of food around. Nowadays, if we've then got a lower metabolic rate and we're surrounded by food, and the tendency is at some point to say, oh, bugger it, I'm going to eat, then we have less resilience because we've got a lower metabolic rate, we're not burning through the calories as quickly, and we end up, relatively overeating even more.
Yes, well, that's, and then weight comes back on, and this is the yo-yo, often what people finding themselves in, that yo-yo dieting, weight gain, weight loss story.
Exactly, and that's why so much of the work we do nowadays is focused on what I call autoregulation. How can we live and how can we eat in a way that allows us to not have to be so restrictive? We're still going to end up eating the right amount of calories, but we don't realize we're doing it. And a big part of that is how the diet is structured. The biggest satiety factors in diet are probably protein in combination with some good quality fats in combination with lots of vegetables. Those things help to fill us up. They also biochemically help to encourage satiety, and people tend to end up eating less. That works because then they don't realize that they're actually reducing their calories a little bit in order to get back to a normal state of being. Okay.
Now, back onto the low carb, high fat, the LCHF, as you said. There are times when it is appropriate, and there are times when it's not appropriate. Could you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, the main thing is, I think, if that is going to help you to adhere and it's going to be the most effective thing for your outcomes, then it's appropriate. I know that seems a little bit probably parsimonious, but what we have certainly observed is that when people are in, let's say, better baseline metabolic health, their blood lipids look fantastic and they're lean and they're active, to go on a very low carb diet, if that's going to be harder to adhere to, makes no sense because there's no real reason to go on that low carb diet. The other time would be that if someone does actually have a very high requirement for carbohydrate because that they're in a very glycolytic or, sugar burning type sport, then it wouldn't make sense to necessarily be on a very low carb diet because they still have that requirement for that fuel. So really it does come down to, number one, adherence, so it's behavioral and habitual factors, and then what's the desired outcome, And one way I look at that is basically the first thing that we should look at before we even worry about splitting up macros is the diet predominantly natural, whole, and unprocessed food? Is it a good quality natural diet? If it is, and I have a client or an athlete come to me and they're eating relatively high amounts of carbohydrate, but they're ripped to shreds, they're performing well, and their bloods look fantastic, there's no way that I'm going to change them to a low-carb diet because what they're doing is working. On the other hand, if they've got that natural, whole, unprocessed base, but it's still not quite working, that's when we start to shift the macros as well.
Mm. And you are now just taking a step back again here with activity, the word activity, because I know we started our conversation with you being a very, you're involved with some elite athletes, and activity, of course, to some people in that area, and people who take their sport very seriously and train really hard is very different from somebody who gets up and just thinks they're going for a walk and that's very active. How do we, what are the nutritional requirements for an elite athlete, let's say? In terms of if they were playing a rugby player, would they be on a higher carbohydrate diet?
Typically, yeah. And then it's going to be, it's still going to be carb appropriate, because what we certainly see nowadays is a lot of athletes are not actually eating the very high carb recommendations that they previously had. One of the reasons is because, like I said earlier on, it doesn't work. It doesn't work with the arithmetic, because you need to preserve that minimum level of fat to ensure that you have optimized hormonal status and help to avoid the incidence of overreaching, overtraining. So we would typically say you should have at least 30% of your calories from fat anyway, even if you're having a higher carb diet. Then you obviously need to ensure that you're having sufficient protein to recover and repair, and if you need to gain some muscle, all those things, you basically need to preserve that amount of protein. And then still then whatever's left can come from carbohydrate. So it's unlikely that a top-level rugby player would be on a low-carb diet, but they're often nowadays on a more moderate carb diet than, say, they would have been recommended back in the 1980s. On the other hand, there are sports like, ultra-endurance, where it's very common for people to be on very low-carb diets because they want to be as fat-adapted as possible, because your glycogen stores are actually fairly limited. So if you're having to go for, 24, 48, or 72 hours, it makes sense that you want to be very well fat-adapted so that you're using fat, predominantly for your fuel source over that time, because you simply would not have enough carbohydrate to fuel that.
Because this whole concept of carb loading before an endurance event, like if you're a triathlete or an endurance runner, that's going to burn out pretty quickly.
Yeah, and for most people, if you're going fast enough, you're probably going to burn out the majority of your glycogen stores within about 90 minutes anyway. And carb loading, the results of research on carb loading more recently have been pretty equivocal. And I remember reading a very interesting, it was a paper, and I think it was republished in the ISSN textbook of sports nutrition. And it concluded that perhaps carb loading was actually a placebo effect.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if an endurance athlete was preparing for an event, to be a predominant fat burner, this isn't something that you just do a few days before an event. You need to be preparing for it.
You do, and that's
how long should we? That should be life, really, shouldn't it?
Well, yeah, you need to allow sufficient time to really upregulate baseline fat burning, and to also encourage a little bit of that keto adaptation. So, at minimum, we're talking at least a couple of weeks there, but really we're probably talking about, 3 months plus if you're really looking at optimized fat adaptation there. There was actually a paper came out a few months ago, and it was a great example of a paper that basically proved what they wanted it to prove. They put people on a low-carb, high-fat diet for 4 days. I think it was 4 days, and then they had them do a time trial, and of course their times went way down. By that stage, you're basically just possibly getting over the keto flu. You might still be suffering from it, and you haven't had any chance to fat adapt at that point. So, it's a pretty, silly study, because you know what's going to happen.
Yeah. But
you allowed those... Sorry, what's that?
You'd be seeing headlines saying low carb, high fat diet does not adversely affect sporting performance.
And that's exactly right. The headlines that we see reported from most studies are terrible. There's no nuance. There's no understanding of context whatsoever. And, now what most athletes who are looking for fat adaptation are doing is they're following a train low, compete high strategy. So they're doing most of their training and most of their daily living very low carb. And they're also using ketogenic supplements and things like that. And then when it comes to events, they're typically using still carbohydrate, and sometimes relatively high levels of carbohydrate during the event. but they're also often using mixed fueling strategies that might include, ketogenic supplements like MCTs or maybe even exogenous ketones.
Now, this segues nicely into our discussion on this ketogenic diet, and I love the fact that you made the point that it's not a light switch. You're not either burning ketones or not. You're always burning some ketones, and I'm guessing, by regulating your nutrition, obviously you'll be burning more ketones. Whether you're in ketosis or not is another thing. What are some of the benefits of a ketogenic diet?
They're pretty varied, really. I mean, the ketogenic diet has been studied for over 100 years now, and it began with epilepsy because they noticed in the early 1900s that if children with epilepsy just weren't eating, they'd often improve. And what was basically happening is they were going into a fasting ketosis. And so then they started to pare down what was actually happening, and they found that these kids were in ketosis. And so that was studied for a long time. And then from there, we basically developed different types of ketogenic diets that were a little bit less restrictive, because those old style classic ketogenic diets for epilepsy were very restrictive. They were very difficult to do. And that was because the levels of ketones required to acutely reduce seizure are pretty high. But the reality is, for most people looking for health benefits or performance benefits, they don't need to be anywhere near as high. And so the diet doesn't have to be anywhere near as restrictive. And so more recently, ketogenic diets have been studied and showing a lot of promise as treatments for Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, just for weight maintenance and health maintenance in the normal population, and also obviously that really promising line of research for particular types of cancer.
Yeah, because that does lead to something that I've always found intriguing, and I've asked other guests on my podcast this, and that is that, PET scans acknowledge that cancer cells preferentially love glucose, I think. And so, it's a great way of locating a cancer by putting radioactive glucose into somebody, and then 10 minutes later, as long as they've been resting and it doesn't go into their muscles, so 10 minutes later, up will light the cancers. But it's never really been explored therapeutically, as you would have thought. So this, can you just talk to us about this fuel source idea? I mean, yeah, the difference between a healthy cell and a cancer cell. Why is this important?
Yeah, it was a long time ago that Otto Warburg identified that there was this sort of glucose preference in cancer cells. And you're right. I mean, there was little attention paid to that for a long period of time because there's not really any other option if you consider that glucose is your only fuel or it's your primary fuel. But as soon as people started to realize that ketones were a viable fuel for the brain and central nervous system, and that we could actually reduce carbohydrate drastically and still be fine and be healthy and function well, then people did start looking into the ketogenic diet for cancer. And so most of the research that's been done both in animals and now in humans has shown that on balance, ketogenic diets are probably very effective for the treatment of cancer, particularly to slow tumor growth and to start to reverse some of that rampant sort of tumor growth and metastasis. There are a few fishhooks in there, though, because although most cancers almost all of the time are predominantly sugar burning, glycolytic, there are some cancer lines and cancer types that do use ketones pretty well as a fuel, and some cancers can rebound and start to use ketones and other fuels quite effectively as well. Now, how that is actually going to play out functionally, we're not sure, because a lot of this is, in vitro or it's animal in vivo research. Often you're flooding cells with ketones that you wouldn't necessarily be doing in the body. And sometimes you're sort of flooding cells with ketones and maybe not having the glucose there as well. So you need to sort of look at, is there a competitive aspect where glucose is going to be used better by the cancer cell, so it's still better to have the ketones there. But we are coming to an interesting point now. We would probably say that for most cancers, most of the time, a keto diet, or at least a lower carb diet at the very least, is likely to be beneficial. But I still take a cautious approach and a pragmatic approach where I definitely do look within my patients at the type of cancer they have and whether it's predominantly ketolytic or glycolytic and make a call based on that.
And which cancers, I mean, can we kind of, what cancers are more sensitive to a ketogenic diet than others? How can you list some of them?
Yeah, I'd probably have to get back to you with exact list. I don't want to sort of say something that'd be incorrect, but a lot of the brain cancers have certainly shown the most promise in the functional research that's been done on ketogenic diets. There are various sort of lines, and so you really need to differentiate between the actual cancer cell that has been biopsied in the patient and look at that directly, because they can be quite different even if they're in a similar part of the body.
Because glucose is one fuel that cancer cells use, but there's another one that our listener will now be familiar with, and that is glutamine.
Yeah.
And glutamine is a lot more tricky, isn't it? I mean, low carb will address the glucose aspect of it, but glutamine being such a common amino acid, how do we control glutamine as a fuel source for cancer cells?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting one, because I think the answer is no one really knows. And people who claim to know, I would say, perhaps are leaping, a little bit too far. They're jumping the shark. Because glutamine is the most abundant amino acid in muscle tissue, it's very easily liberated, particularly if you are under a lot of stress, whether that be from, say, chemotherapy, or whether that is from, the psycho-emotional stress of having cancer. I mean, this is a tough situation to be in. That stress response is going to drive gluconeogenesis, but it's also going to drive potentially the liberation of glutamine because you're breaking down tissue. So it sort of points to the multifactorial nature of how we need to treat cancer. We can't just say, well, a keto diet's going to work and it's a magic pill. Excuse the pun there. I know Pete's just made his documentary. I didn't mean to do that. Pete's a buddy. He's a good guy. Yeah. But it's not certainly going to be a silver bullet there. Neither is, the avoidance of protein, for example, because people freak out about protein because it's going to provide glutamine. But when we consider that most of the glutamine that we're going to potentially use is probably going to be freed up from tissue we break down, and cancer cells will co-opt cells around them to either produce fuels, or they will encourage the breakdown of cells around them to give them the fuels they require. We need to look at this pragmatically and holistically. That's why I typically say that, on balance, what we can see is that lower carb diets are better because there's less glucose load, and glucose is the preferred fuel. But then we need to look at reducing stress, reducing catabolism or breakdown of tissue, and ketones could help with that as well. I would say we also need to not oversupply ketones. Now, I could be wrong there, but one thing that I've talked about with my colleagues a lot is this idea that people are chasing higher and higher levels of ketones. But that doesn't seem to make sense, because total fuel availability is a critical part of anabolism. If you're going to have cells growing and multiplying, if you're providing lots of an alternative fuel and they do happen to be able to become ketolytic and use it, you're certainly not going to be helping yourself. So I think keeping fuel overall in balance is a critical thing. Not having too much sugar, not oversupplying carbohydrate, not oversupplying ketones, and having appropriate levels of protein intake with all the other goodies that we need from vegetables and things like that.
Yeah. Now, and this goes back to your sort out the macronutrient requirements for an individual of their fat and their protein based on the individual's activity, genetic makeup, metabolism, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, I think for a lot of people who are looking at prevention, not treatment, it's actually easier than they think, because if we base our meals on vegetables and we try and get up to that 9+ servings of vegetables a day, and we have good quality fats with them, and we make sure we have a good serve of protein at every meal, really that takes care of all of our bases. Then if the person wants to eat some extra good quality carbohydrate on top of that, typically they end up auto-regulating pretty well. And because people don't need to be all keto all the time, that works very well for adherence because people can get it. They can understand what a plate of food then looks like.
Gee, Cliff, I love some of these expressions you're using about appropriate nutrition and auto-regulation. This is very empowering, very empowering. Now, listen, you also use this term, which I hadn't heard, but I think people who are struggling with the ketogenic diet may certainly go, aha, so that's what it is. Tell us about Keto Flu.
Yeah, so Keto Flu, it's an interesting one because when we started looking at doing some research a couple of years ago, it was a term that I had thrown around and people in the keto space had thrown around for a long time. And when we looked in the scientific literature, there were no instances of the term at all. And although people had looked at some of the adverse effects generally of ketogenic diets, no one had specifically looked at this keto flu period, which is that first few days of a ketogenic diet. And yet when we looked just through a Google search, there were over 22,000 results showing keto flu in the common literature, but zero in the scientific literature. So basically keto flu is when people go on a ketogenic diet, they obviously restrict carbohydrate drastically, and they can sometimes experience some adverse effects. And they range from nausea to headaches to muscle weakness to cramps to lightheadedness. And, it feels a little bit like that early onset of the flu. You just feel pretty crap for a few days. And it basically results from a few things. The main thing is that when you go on a low-carb diet, you have lower insulin levels overall, and that changes the way that the kidney is excreting nutrients. So basically you get rid of more water, you get rid of more sodium, and you get rid of more potassium. So you get rid of basically more water and more salts, and that changes your electrolyte balance, and you feel pretty crap as a result. There's also a little bit of a lag there where perhaps you don't have the fuel that you used to, which is sugar, and you need to supply something else, and your body hasn't caught up and it's not producing enough ketones yet. And so you don't have enough fuel. And so what can also happen there is the body goes into a little bit of stress because it's trying to free up a little bit of extra glucose through breakdown of tissue to supply some of that fuel as well.
So are there some specific supplements or nutrients that can help people through this problem?
Yeah, definitely. And it's quite easy to mitigate. When we look at the things that are actually happening in keto flu, it tells us pretty much what we need to do. We're flushing out more water, so people need to make sure they drink a little bit extra. Even if it's just a couple of extra glasses a day, that's typically enough. Because we're flushing out extra salts, people should take a little bit of extra salt throughout the day, and even an extra half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of salt added to food through the day is probably going to be sufficient. And we actually recommend, or my team now recommend, that people use low salt for those first few days. If you know what that is, it's the potassium sodium blend that people used to use if they were reducing sodium in their diet, because it has sodium, but it also has potassium in there as well. So you're getting both potassium, sodium. Eating plenty of veggies in those first few days of a keto diet also helps provide that potassium. Typically, when people do that, they have enough water, they have enough of those electrolytes, sodium, potassium, they typically feel a heck of a lot better. If they're not, then that kind of tells us that it's probably also related to fuel. And then adding some extra fat can help, but particularly adding smart fats like MCTs, which are ketogenic. They are converted basically straight away to ketones, and they also encourage ketogenesis of other fats. They can really help. And
MCTs being?
MCTs are medium chain triglycerides.
Yeah. I knew that. I knew that, but I just wanted our listener to.
Yeah, I know that you know that, there, Ron.
Okay.
And I appreciate you pulling me back sometimes and explaining to the audience.
That's okay. Yeah, so MCTs providing. Is coconut oil an MCT?
Yes and no, and there's a lot of debate around it. It is. Structurally it is, but it's predominantly lauric acid, which is a C12 fat. In other words, it's got 12 carbon chains. That's the longer end of MCTs, and there's a lot of debate as to whether that functionally is ketogenic. Now, a lot of people say that it's not, and it simply doesn't work that way. I actually think they're incorrect, and we're going to do some research on this because we've observed clinically that lauric acid, although it's not as good as the other MCTs, it's still ketogenic. The difference is that instead of maybe 90% of it being converted to ketones, instead of about 90% of it going straight to the liver to be converted to ketones, it's somewhere between 30 and say 60 or 70%. So it's still ketogenic, but maybe not as much as the other MCTs.
But MCT you can take as a supplement.
Yeah, you buy it as a supplement. It's typically an oil, or you can get MCT powders now. The MCT oils are nice and easy. You can just add them to your coffee or to your smoothies, or have them as part of your salad dressings. Super easy, very inexpensive, and they, are proven ketogenic supplements. I mean, I did my master's degree in MCTs, and so I've spent a lot of time with them. A lot of people now are also using exogenous ketones to help get over that hump. If they feel a bit of brain fog or some of those symptoms of keto flu in the first few days, they just basically take a sachet of exogenous ketones, which are directly ketones. So they're actually ketones in a supplement that you can just take. They provide ketones straight away along with some extra salts because they're typically bound to salts. And so it really helps hit that keto flu from both directions.
Does the low salt combo, I get that is, as opposed to just being sodium chloride, low salt is replace the sodium with the potassium. How does Himalayan rock salt fit into that equation? Or that's still too high? That doesn't have enough potassium?
Yeah, Himalayan salt's still great because it obviously provides for the sodium that you require, but because a lot of people are probably a little bit low in potassium anyway, having that low salt does help to just cover off that base as well. It's not absolutely necessary because I typically find that when people are adding a bit of extra salt to their meals and they're having plenty of veggies, which sounds weird on a ketogenic diet, but there is method to the madness, they are getting enough potassium as well. The reason I say it sounds a bit weird is a lot of people drastically reduce vegetables because they feel that they can't have any carbohydrate whatsoever on a keto diet. But green veggies, those fibrous vegetables, they actually provide very little usable carbohydrate anyway. And they provide bulk, they provide prebiotic fibers that the body can actually convert into ketogenic byproducts in the body. And the carb load that you're getting from them is not high enough typically to inhibit you getting into ketosis. So it's just worth having them for health and for the other general benefits.
Gosh, Cliff, we've just covered so much territory here. Listen, if we're going to leave our listener who is wanting to avoid disease and just be as healthy as they can, given what we've discussed here today, what would be a couple of tips that you would give our listener to keep them healthy?
Yeah, the biggest one that I tell people first up is don't snack. There's no need to snack. We don't need to drip feed nutrients into the system over the day, all that kind of stuff. We should eat when we're hungry until we're full. Our plate should be based on protein first, then vegetables, and add good quality oils to it. That's basically enough for a meal. If people then want to eat a little bit of extra carbohydrate, that's fine. But the take-home message is that natural, whole, and unprocessed is the first stop. And if that's enough, we shouldn't worry too much about other things. Perfect. I guess the other aspects are, we need to move daily and we want to make sure we're sleeping well.
Yeah, great. Now, listen, taking a step back even further from all of this, what do you think, and just this is a final question now, what do you think the biggest challenge is for people, and we're all on this journey as either practitioners or patients, what do you think the biggest challenge is for people on their health journey through life in our modern world?
I think the biggest challenge is not listening to oneself. The reason I say that is we've lost our ability to respond to what's happening within the body. And I think we've lost that ability because we're so stressed, we move so quickly, we're always thinking about the next stage rather than just being in the moment. And that's important because it plays into all sorts of things. We talked before about hunger and how we've forgotten what that's like, but also we've actually forgotten what it feels like to be full as well. And we can't feel hunger properly, and we can't feel what we actually require unless we actually get full. But those things also require us to step back and be more mindful. If we encourage mindfulness and have a mindful practice of life, we typically tend to go to bed when we need to. We typically tend to respond better to the stressful stuff in our lives. We typically tend to move when we need to. We typically tend to eat when we need to, and we recognize that hunger is just a natural state and it's actually okay.
Cliff, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fantastic conversation. We're going to have links to your website. I know you've written some fabulous books, and we'll have links to those as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Ron. It's been a lot of fun, mate.
I love the concept of appropriate. Also starting with macronutrients like fats and proteins. There are some fats that we can't produce, so we need to consume foods that have these essential, that's why they're called essential, fatty acids. Proteins are made up of 20 amino acids. Now, our bodies can produce some, but about 9 of those we can't produce, so they are called essential as well because we just can't produce them. Notice that there are no carbohydrates, that third category of macronutrients that are essential. So that word essential is also clearly very important. Also, not listening to ourselves, being in the moment, being mindful. Important thoughts for us all. So much great stuff there and so much more to talk with Cliff about. We're going to have links to his website and all his books. I think they're just terrific. They are so worth a read. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who